In the early history of Old Oyo, the Alaafin, that is the king, was supreme over other beings. The Alaafin was an absolute ruler whose word was law. He had the power of life and death. He was known as the companion of the gods. Even though the Alaafin was an absolute monarch, he governed with a council known as the Oyo 7 councillors of the state headed by the Basharon or the Prime Minister. The Oyo did not just elect a new king, they also acted as a check and balance to the absolute powers of the Alaafin to curtail its excesses, as many despotic kings would rise during the 500-year history of Old Oyo. Around 700 years ago, Basharon Erindilogun Agbonkoshe, the head of the Oyo approached Alaafin Ajaka, also known as Ajaka, who had succeeded Alaafin Oranyan, and advised him to step down, as according to the Oyo Ajaka was too gentle to be an Alaafin of Oyo. Unsurprisingly, the calm and gentle king acceded to the request. Unlike his father and predecessor, Ajaka was of peaceful disposition who loved animal husbandry and encouraged it among the Oyo people. The Alaafin hated wars and avoided them with other kingdoms surrounding Oyo. In fact, he paid tribute to his cousin Olowu and was seen as weak by the Oyo. Therefore, it was not startling that he stepped down. As a result, Ajaka relocated to Igbo, where he remained in retirement for the next 7 years. So, what happened in Oyo during Alaafin Ajaka's 7-year exile at Igbo? Immediately after Alaafin Ajaka stepped down, the Basharon and the kingmakers replaced him with his fearless and violent half-brother Sango, who then settled in the capital, Oko. Alaafin Sango had the habit of emitting fire and smoke from his mouth. His mother was the daughter of Elempe, a Nupe king, who formed an alliance with Oranyan by giving out his daughter as his wife. Thus, Sango was half Nupe, half Oyo. The new Alaafin never grew up to know his mother, as she died when he was still a baby. But Sango's finger was thicker than his father's waist. The kingmakers, who had coveted him to be the Alaafin because of his wild, warlike disposition and fiery temper to destroy his enemies, did not know what was in store for them. His first act was to resist Olowu, who took advantage of Sango's youth by demanding tribute from him. But the fiery king refused and Olowu besieged Oko. With volumes of smoke coming out of his mouth and nostrils, Olowu and his army became terrified and were completely routed. Therefore, with his fresh victory and other subsequent victories, Sango family established himself on the throne. He was therefore too joyous and became tyrannical. With his smoke, fire and lightning, Sango greatly increased the dread his subjects had of him. The Alaafin defeated other kings that surrounded him and expanded the Oyo kingdom. He fought many battles and was fond of making charms. His next move changed the face of the Oyo kingdom for the next 300 years. So, what was Sango's next move? Sango's next ambition was to move the capital from Oko to Oyo, then known as Oyokoro. The Alaafin knew he would meet with strong opposition from the Prince of Oyo, so he devised a cunning method to approach the situation without much fighting. Sango wished to worship at the grave of his dead mother, but he did not know her name, for she died when he was an infant. So, Sango sent his executioner and his Hausa slave to Nupe for the purpose of giving them a horse and a cow for the sacrifice. The king's charge to these messengers was that they should listen carefully to the first name uttered in the invocation, which evidently would be his mother's name. His maternal grandfather, Elempe, heartily welcomed and highly entertained them so much that the slave forgot himself and the duty he was charged with. When they returned to Sango, the executioner gave his answer, but the slave could not, probably because he was drunk, and Sango punished him severely. The punishment he suffered was 122 razor cuts slashed all over his body as a lasting warning for all time. Surprisingly, Sango's wives loved the scars on the slave's body because they made him look beautiful and comely. As a result, they advised that henceforth such marks should not be performed upon a slave but on actual members of the royal family as a sign of royalty. Sango took this advice and placed himself in the hands of the markers, but he could only stand 2 cuts on each arm as he felt weak and forbade them to proceed any further. Sango's marks are now called Oyo marks and are solely reserved for the royal family of Oyo. Thus, members of the royal family are called Akeyo. So, when Alaafin Sango was determined to take Oyokoro, it occurred to him that he should employ this as a device by which he could easily fulfill his plan without loss of lives. He then sent the slave to the Prince of Oyo, Oyokoro, for him to see how beautiful he looked with these marks, and that it has been resolved to use the same as a mark of royalty. He therefore advised the Oyokoro to submit himself to be marked along with other principal chiefs for rank and beauty, stating that he himself, as the Alaafin, had done so. The Oyokoro and his chiefs gladly accepted, and Sango sent his 2 markers, and they performed their tasks perfectly. However, on the 3rd day, while the Oyokoro and his chiefs were still very sore, Sango appeared with his forces against them. As they were too weak, they could not fight, and Oyo fell easily into Sango's hands. The Alaafin, with shame in his eyes, brutally put the prince and his chiefs to their deaths. Thus, the seat of government was permanently removed from Oko to Oyo-Ile. Sango reigned for 7 years, the whole of which period was marked by his restlessness. He fought many battles and was fond of making charms. He was said to have the knowledge of some preparation by which he could attract lightning that one day killed his wives and his children. Oyo was now astir, not only to sympathize with the Alaafin, but also to tell him to step down, as the people had an abhorrence for a king who was fond of making deadly charms. Because for one who already had absolute power invested in him by law, this strange power could only be used spitefully so that no one near him would be safe. The kingmakers could not take it anymore, and the new Bashorun, Salekuodi, boldly told Sango that the gods and the people had rejected him as Alaafin and he had to commit suicide. The Alaafin complied and hanged himself on a shea butter tree at Koso. His staunch followers later deified him as a god. With shame in their eyes, the Oyomesi then recalled Ajaka, his brother, from exile, and he once more held the reins of government. To this day, Alaafin Ajaka remains the only royal in the over 700-year history of Oyo to have ruled twice as king. However, around 200 years later, in 1457, the king of Nupe invaded Oyo and sacked the capital, forcing Alaafin Onigbogi to flee to the Bariba country, where he died. The seat of the Alaafin at the capital was then vacant for 50 years. Interestingly, Oyo would later conquer Nupe and rise from a powerful kingdom to a vast empire, reaching its height in the 18th century with Basharun Gaa as the prime minister. You can learn more about Basharun Gaa in our next episode.